Genesis 6 contains a name that sparks endless debate, the Nephilim. The Bible mentions them briefly, and then leaves a mystery. So let's stick to what the text actually says. First, Genesis says sons of God and daughters of men. It describes a union, but doesn't explain every detail. Then it says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and it connects them to mighty men of old. That phrase points to reputation, famous, feared, remembered, but here's the key. The Bible doesn't define sons of God here. So interpreters formed three main views. View 1. Some read sons of God as heavenly beings. They point to places where sons of God can mean spiritual beings, but Genesis 6 still stays vague, so let's read the clues carefully, because the Nephilim debate isn't one view, it's three main readings, and each view tries to explain the same short lines. The text says, the sons of God, the daughters of men, and the Nephilim. It describes a union, without giving a step-by-step explanation, which means we must not add what isn't written. Genesis introduces the name, then closes the file. Even the word Nephilim isn't fully explained in the passage. Some link the word to falling, but that's not a locked definition. So we label it as possible meaning, not absolute proof. Genesis also calls them mighty men of old, men of renown. Renown means reputation, stories people repeated for generations. So the text highlights impact, not a detailed anatomy chart. That's the pattern, big statement, limited details, which is why people argue, because the Bible stays brief. If sons of God means spiritual beings, this scene feels cosmic. But Genesis 6 doesn't clearly say angels, so don't overclaim. It remains an interpretation based on patterns elsewhere. Another view says sons of God means a godly lineage. It reads Genesis as moral compromise spreading, but the passage doesn't name Seth or Cain directly. A third view sees sons of God as powerful rulers claiming status, because kings often use divine language to justify control. That view fits the theme of corruption, but it's still interpretation. So we hold the views and refuse to pretend we have certainty. Now what does Genesis emphasize instead? Genesis 6 is building toward one theme. The world went corrupt, violence spreads, and judgment enters the narrative. So the Nephilim mention isn't random. It sits inside a warning. It's one piece of the picture before the flood story unfolds, and that's where the focus shifts. Not monsters, but moral collapse. Genesis 6 does not give permission for wild fan fiction. It doesn't describe lab experiments, aliens, or secret hybrid manuals. It gives a name and then moves on. So the safest rule is, don't go beyond the text. Mystery isn't a flaw. Sometimes it's a test of humility. Later texts mention giants, yet that's not the same verse. You can connect ideas, but only with context. Genesis 6 gives clues, timing, reputation, and corruption. Here's the twist. The Bible leaves the Nephilim unexplained on purpose. You get enough to wonder, not enough to boast. So whichever view you choose, hold it with humility. The passage mentions marriage, then mentions the Nephilim, then moves forward. Because the main story is the flood, judgment on corruption. The Nephilim appear like a headline in a chapter about evil spreading. If a verse is unclear, don't build a doctrine on it. Build on what Scripture repeats clearly. And treat mysteries as invitations to humility, not obsession. Renown can mean hero or tyrant depending on the story told. So mighty men doesn't automatically mean good men. It means they mattered, they changed the world around them. So who were the Nephilim? The honest answer, Scripture doesn't fully say, and that honesty matters more than a flashy theory, because adding details can distort the Bible's real warning. Genesis 6 points to corruption, then to judgment, then to a reset, so don't miss the message chasing the mystery. Quick question. Which view have you heard? Spiritual beings, lineage, or rulers? Drop it below, and I'll pin the clearest explanation. Next, we can talk about biblical giants, Anakim, Rephaim, and Goliath. because the Bible mentions more than one giant tradition. But today's conclusion is simple. Genesis 6 is brief on purpose. Read what's written and don't pretend it says more. That's how you stay faithful to Scripture. If you want more Bible mysteries explained clearly, follow. And tell me the next topic: giants, angels, or the flood.